Hey everybody, it's Jim from Cigars. And today we're going to talk about probably what is the biggest calamity for most cigar smokers, and that is finding mold on your cigars. It's something we work hard to avoid by taking care of our humidors, but if it happens, it is a big problem. So let's talk about mold, but the first thing we need to do is ask ourselves a question: is this mold or is it something else? There are several markings on wrappers that can be basically blemishes that we don't have to worry about. So let's talk about a couple of those and eliminate the easier ones. One of the things that gets mistaken for mold most often is chlorophyll. And tobacco leaves are green as they go into the curing process, but sometimes there's a wrinkle or something, or a drop of water, as we'll talk about. And a part of the tobacco does not cure fully, so it has kind of a green tinge to it. Sometimes it's a little dot, and they call those frog's eyes. Sometimes it is along a seam. If you see that and it's flat on the surface of the wrapper, there's nothing sticking up or no little hairy fingers or anything on it, that's not mold, that's just chlorophyll and nothing to be concerned about. Another thing similar to that are water spots. As the tobacco leaf is cured, sometimes there's a water spot that gets on it, and that manifests itself not always as green, but sometimes it's kind of a tannish color. You might have a Maduro, a darker wrapper, and there'll be a little spot, maybe a 1/16 of an inch at most, pretty small, that is tan or very light brown. And that's just a water spot. The last thing we might see that we shouldn't worry about is just the adhesive, the gama that cigar makers use when they make a cigar. And sometimes that appears along the seams, sometimes near the cap. It sort of looks like dried Elmer's glue. And if you see that again, nothing to worry about. Okay, now we're going to move on into a little bit of a controversial area. You're probably not going to believe this, but cigar smokers are a pretty opinionated bunch. And one of the things that really bring out strong opinions is whether or not plume exists. Some people say it's a natural occurrence that happens in aging cigars, nothing to worry about. And others say that it's just a way for cigar makers or cigar shops to pawn off moldy cigars on unsuspecting consumers. If we're talking about plume, it generally looks like either a white powder on the wrapper of the cigar, or sometimes like little tiny salt crystals. So those are the two appearances it might have. It is almost always white, sometimes a little bit with a grayish tinge to it. And what that is solidified oils. The oils oxidize with the air and kind of crystallize on the surface of the cigar. Plume is said to be found only in cigars that have been aged a long time. And I don't think you see it very much in residential humidors for most people. And you don't even see it too much in retailers. I've seen what I would probably refer to as plume on a couple of occasions, but all that tells me is that cigar has been on the shelf too long and I'm not going to buy it anyway. So it's kind of a moot point. Another thing about plume is that it wipes off without leaving a mark. So if you see something that looks like plume, wipe it off with your finger, just brush it very gently, and your wrapper should be pristine underneath. Also, there's no odor associated with plume. So if you see something that looks like mold or plume on your cigar and you give it a little sniff test, if it's mold, it's going to smell kind of rancid. If it's plume, it's not going to have any odor other than your cigar. Last but not least, plume never appears on the foot of a cigar. If you have something growing on the foot of your cigar, it is 100% mold. Mold can be different colors. There's different strains of mold. And the one thing I want to point out as I talk about this, some molds are harmless. You can smoke the cigar and nothing's going to happen to you. Some can make you really sick. So if you have any doubt whether something is mold on a cigar and you suspect it is mold, you're rolling the dice if you smoke it. Mold can be bluish, it can be greenish, it can be black, it can be even whitish in color. But you differentiate it because it has a velvety or a fuzzy texture. And sometimes you almost see like little threads growing off of it. As I said before, it can grow on the foot of the cigar as well as the wrapper, and may have a musty sort of odor to it. Another sign of mold is if you try to brush it off with your finger like they say to do with plume, there's going to be a sticky residue underneath, and your finger is going to feel sticky when you rub it together. That's a good sign that it's mold. So let's go back to the great debate. Does plume really exist? My answer is I don't know. I have not seen it very much, to be honest with you. Certainly not in my own humidor. I mentioned I saw it at a couple of retail outlets that maybe it was plume, but I don't know. So if you're a believer in Plume, follow the advice I just gave you. And if you're a non-believer and you think everything is mold, just be careful. Then we're going to have to get rid of the cigars. Now we're going to operate under the assumption that we have discovered mold on our cigars. So what do? It's really a three-step process. Within the three main steps, there's some intermediate steps as well. So let's talk about step one, and that is cleaning house. Take all your cigars out and prepare to have a new home for them for at least 3 or 4 weeks. The specific cigars that have mold, you pretty much have to discard them. There's nothing you can do about it. Here's some bad advice. Do not follow this advice, but I read it in one place. They said wipe your moldy cigars down with isopropyl alcohol, which will kill mold. There's no question about it, at least on the surface. And then you can, when they dry out, you can smoke them. Man, all I'm going to tell you is I would not do that. I think that's a bad idea. The third thing we want to do when we're cleaning house is get rid of our humidification devices. So if you have water crystals or water beads, man, those right away, get rid of those. Those got to go. And also bovitas. You do have to worry about bovitas because remember, they have two-way transfer of moisture. And as they're transferring that moisture back into the bovita, they are probably picking up some mold spores as well. You pretty much have to get rid of all your humidification devices. All right, now we've cleaned house, on to step two. Brush out the interior with a soft brush, or if you have a vacuum attachment that's small and you can get it into your humidor, brush off the sides and everything else. I should mention, we've taken the shelves out, we've taken the cigars out, so we just have an empty box at this point. Brush it off and then vacuum up the residue, or vacuum it off with a brush attachment. Now we want to take a flashlight and look inside our humidor and try to find mold spots. So this would be white spots or green spots or blue spots, something that indicates mold growing on the Spanish cedar. You want to get yourself some 150 extra fine sandpaper and gently sand those areas. And you got to be careful because on the liner of most humidors, the Spanish cedar is pretty thin. So we don't want to necessarily end up going through that Spanish cedar. Just get the surface off. And you don't do that over the whole thing. You just have to do it on the trouble spots. Now we took out our shelves, and you should give those a once over too. And honestly, I think it's sometimes easier just to spend a few bucks. Replacement shelves are standard sizes generally, and they're usually pretty cheap. So if it were me and it happened to me, I would probably end up replacing my shelves. Now we want to use isopropyl alcohol and put it on a clean cloth, but not wet. We want it to be damp. We're not trying to create wet spots inside our humidor. We just want a dampness that's going to transfer some of the alcohol to the Spanish cedar. So wipe it very gently with this isopropyl alcohol dampened cloth. After we're done with that, we want to wipe down the interior with distilled water. And it's vitally important to use distilled water. If you have mold in your humidor, it might be because you're not using distilled water. It's like $2 a gallon in a grocery store. You just look for steam distilled water. And what we want to do is dilute that alcohol that we just put into our humidor. Now leave it open, at least a crack, to dry for a day or two. Make sure the air is clean around it. We don't want to be introducing mold back into it. And now we can move on to our third stage, and that is rebooting our humidor. Because again, remember, we let that Spanish cedar wood dry out pretty much. So we really have to start the reseasoning process as if it's a new humidor. Now's the hard part. We got to wait for at least 2 weeks. 3 is even better. And keep our cigars out of there, have our humidor sealed, and we want to be putting our new humidification into there at 65 or 67, 69, whatever you want to do. But we got to wait 2 weeks before we put our cigars in, because what we're looking for is a reemergence of mold. And that applies both to the humidor, something might crop up that we missed, or on the cigars that we've put into quarantine. So keep an eye on those for 2 weeks. 3 weeks is even better. See if there's any reemergence of the mold. And if it isn't, move on to the last step, which is the happy step, and that's restocking our humidor. It's a time-consuming process, and I think by now you've probably said to yourself, isn't it easier just to work really hard to prevent mold? And the answer to that is yes. So let's talk about how we're going to do that. And the most commonly cited reason is too high of humidification and temperature in our humidor. control between 65 and 70% relative humidity and 70 degrees, and really monitor that closely. Second cause is what I mentioned before, and that is using non-distilled water. Tap water, in my opinion, is a guarantee you're going to end up with mold in your humidor. A third cause, and this is more common than you might think, is putting an infected cigar into your humidor. Maybe your buddy gives you a cigar that he picked up in the Bahamas, or maybe you buy a new batch of cigars at a cigar shop or get them online. And you put an infected cigar that looks clean because the mold spores haven't developed yet, but there you go, you got mold in your humidor. Those are the main reasons why mold forms, but there's a couple other ones too. Handle your cigars as little as possible. And wash your hands before you start handling cigars in your humidor, especially if they aren't in cellophane. Because mold spores are all over the place, and you pick some up on your hand and you touch your cigar, and then you put it in the conditions of a humidor that promote mold growth, and you got mold. And a good tip to follow too is making sure your cigars have good air circulation. And that means not packing your humidor to the max. They say that you should pack at about 75% capacity and rotate them once in a while to keep the air movement going and evened out. My wish to you is that you have my experience, and that's never having mold in your humidor. Prevent it if you can, but if you do, follow the steps we talked about and get rid of it, and you can start all over. Okay, see you next time from Cigars, Cigars, Cigars.